And I'm always extremely impressed with how much attention and honor you give to your children's education, because I think it's really the best investment that you can make, is for your children's future. And of course, there is a lot, as Bella was just saying, that this time of year is especially one of heightened awareness about college acceptances. And if your child, if this is the first time you're going through this process, or you've already had kids go through it, or you can anticipate from your other friends you've had go through this process, that there's a lot to consider. Even for American parents who went through this themselves 20 years ago, it's so different than it used to be. The college admissions process has drastically changed. So today I hope to be able to give you some insights into strategies. And so, the original topic is on Ivy League applications, and I've kind of expanded it to just think about highly selective college applications. So typically we talk about highly selective colleges as those with an acceptance rate of less than 20%. So that is not the majority of colleges or universities in the US. However, that number is increasing right now because there's a drastic increase in the number of applications to a very small number of colleges and universities, due to a variety of factors, of course, the pandemic. And it's kind of this never-ending cycle that we're seeing right now of now there's more and more schools going test optional. Just heard that if you live in the New York area, like where Bella is, the State University of New York system just announced that, I'm sorry, my dog is, I'm sorry about that. Hey, Jet, no, Jet, come here. Sorry, he thinks somebody's here at my house. So the State University of New York system just announced that it is going permanently test optional. And then there are other universities that are also test optional, such as the University of California system. So all of that has made it such that there are more applicants applying to more schools, and that has made it increasingly competitive. So today I hope to kind of show you that there's not, and I'll come back to this a couple times, that there's not really any sort of secret silver bullet to getting into an Ivy League university. If anybody tries to tell you that there's some sort of secret guaranteed strategy that will work for you, it's just not really the case. But the good news is that there's both traditional strategies that you can use in creative ways and also some kind of innovative strategies. And so I think the two main parts that we'll look at today are about yourself, so yourself being the student, and then your application. So when you think about strategies for applying, as Bella was saying, that your application is not just the time when your student opens their Common App account. It doesn't just begin when you're filling out that application. Really, it begins in 9th grade. And honestly, earlier than that, when your student is developing their foundational study skills, discovering their interests, and really starting to elevate their profile, so that each year consecutively, when they get older through high school, they have more opportunities to take advantage of increasingly challenging academic course material, as well as increasingly impressive extracurricular leadership and impact opportunities that will then be very visible on the application itself. So first, just to look at the profile development, and I'll keep coming back to this too, is that it's really important, even if it seems very self-evident, to really just look at what colleges say that they want in a student. So for example, Princeton has on their website, we look for students with intellectual curiosity, who have pursued and achieved academic excellence. We also look for students with strong personal and extracurricular accomplishments. So they're not directly saying we want students with a perfect transcript. They're not saying you must have, this GPA. Intellectual curiosity is actually what comes first. And so that's something that I think, often gets overlooked, because the students who are really intellectual, they also tend to read a lot. As parents, you can be encouraging habits of curiosity, of exploration, from a very young age, to be just, rather than just being on TikTok all the time or other social media. What can you encourage your kids to do? And a lot of that is also role modeling. Kids do what they see their parents do too. So can you have discussions with your kids over dinner about certain topics? I'm amazed and sometimes not at how few students I talk to actually know what their parents do for work. You can talk to your students from also a younger age about what you do, get them interested in that. If I also see a lot of students who in 9th or 10th grade, maybe they start to think, I think I want to go into business. I want to go into, I want to be in finance. I was like, well, why? No idea. They've never picked up a Wall Street Journal. Never heard of the magazine, The Economist. There's so much at, your fingertips on the internet, that it's really important to just give kids a very wide and deep exposure early on, so that they have a foundation and they can start to figure out, both with guidance and somewhat self-directed of what they're actually interested in. So if you just, really focus on the grades, and they're not excited about the learning, it is going to be evident to colleges that they're doing things for the tests rather than for the learning. And that also can come through. So we can see, this personal profile development is then also reflected in the holistic admissions process. Essentially, these different elements of intellectual curiosity, academic excellence, and your accomplishments, all of those feed into these different parts of the admissions process of the application materials. And so it should be evident, how you have explored your curiosity. It should be evident, that your teachers think you're a really curious person. They're not going to be saying in their teacher recommendation letters, just that you're a hard worker, but it should go beyond that, right? And so that's really what, if you're looking at an Ivy League level school or a highly selective school, you want to be thinking about not just these final factors of what goes into the application, but it really has to start with your student, and cultivating that, that curiosity, that interest, and then obviously, of course, the diligence to be able to excel academically. And so we can talk also a little bit later about, how to figure out the extracurriculars and that piece of it. And as Bella had mentioned, the academics and the test scores, those are kind of a given at this level of a school. And so you really have to go well above and beyond all of that in order to be able to stand out. And then in terms of kind of more traditional application strategies, I'll just look at each of these, because I think they're understood but underappreciated, oftentimes in the application process, because usually when you are building a college list, students and families will tend to focus on factors such as location and selectivity. And then kind of that's it. And maybe, size of school, or if it's, urban, more urban, like I want to be near a city on the coast and go to a selective school. And that's kind of it. That is not enough research. The way to be able to be successful in an application process is to really understand what it is about the universities and colleges you're applying to that makes it a good fit for you, and also therefore what you will contribute to that institution academically, and otherwise. So you really need to be able to make that match. It's a very different concept in the US than almost anywhere else, this concept of fit. But I can tell you that the supplemental essays that students write, they often seem like an afterthought when you're starting this process. Oh my gosh, I'm just going to have to write all these essays. I'll just make this college list and then I'll write the essays. But if you don't think about that college list and the fit, and really research the schools and understand what kind of students they're looking for, and am I that kind of student? It's going to be either much easier or much harder writing those essays. And it also means that the admissions officers reading them are going to be able to tell that you're either a good fit or you're not, because you can't really fake that very much. You can try, but it can be pretty obvious. So just to give an example, so I had a student this year, who's very, very strong in neuroscience, and kind of almost against what his parents wanted. But he fell in love with Washington University in St. Louis. And it was obviously it was a very difficult application cycle. And he had applied elsewhere for early decision. A Chinese boy who goes to a top boarding school in the US. It's a very difficult season. But he pretty much, because he was able to identify Washington University, WashU in St. Louis, which is, it's a top 10 for neuroscience in the US. And I think it's like, I don't know what the ranking is this year. It's like maybe 15 or something. But they're building a new neuroscience research building right now, like massive investment in neuroscience studies. And so we had him really target that and even follow up with the admissions office. He didn't apply their ED or ED2. He just applied their regular decision. But it ended up, he followed up with another additional email and outreach, really outlining why neuroscience at WashU was going to be such a good fit for him. He studies Alzheimer's. They have a really strong Alzheimer's focus. And so just being able to have the admissions officer say, wow, like you really know us very well. And it means you're probably really likely to come here, and we can see exactly how you're going to contribute. So that's just an example of really doing your research and seeing what is coming in the future for what that university is investing in, what they care about, and showing how your contributions are aligned to the future of that university. And then another part of this is, researching the universities, and then also showing the fit of really why you are applying. So just another example, this is an essay of one of my students who got into Wharton. And so this is, just to show you, if you're not familiar with supplemental essays, how did you discover your intellectual and academic interests, and how will you explore them at UPenn? So to just give a sense, like, how much depth you need to have, and then also how you link it to specific universities, because you really have to know, why. So this student who was successful, started with going back a little bit in his story about how he was obsessed with economics from a very young age, highlighting how he developed his interest in economics. I've just changed some of the personal names of things. He was very successful in the Wharton investment competition. He published research. He quantifies. He published 11 research papers with this club that he founded. He collaborated with a think tank. He participated in the International Economics Olympiad. And then he links this to a professor at UPenn and shows how that professor's research actually helped him already. And so he links his past experiences and research he's done into the future of how he sees himself contributing to Wharton. And obviously, yeah, and then, talking specifics about how he will get involved in UPenn community and at Wharton. So this kind of seamless integration of looking at your past and really knowing what you want in your future and being able to identify the specific resources at the institution, that kind of makes it very easy for an admissions officer, because they want to be able to envision a student. You don't want to have to make them work at all. You want them to just be able to imagine you on the campus very clearly, how you will be a successful contributing student, and into the future, how will you be a successful alumni. So that's kind of what you want to do for them in the supplemental essays. And then with the other piece, of course, there's a lot of talk around the application rounds. Where do I apply? Early decision, early action, or restricted early action, regular decision, early decision 2. There's so many different options, and all of these different strategies. Of course, the common wisdom is, definitely, you have to apply early decision, and then early decision 2. But I would say, when we're talking about especially the Ivy League schools, not all of them have early decision, right? A lot of them do not. They may have, restricted early action, and some of them have early decision. And so you really have to also understand who else is applying, if it's restricted early action or early decision. And then how much does that really increase your odds? And then if you are taking the chance in, your ultimate dream school at a restricted early action, what are you sacrificing in the process, right? Because if you can only apply to one, you can't apply to another. And so you really need to really understand the data. The data is much more complex than just the acceptance rate, because at these schools in the early round, there's also athletes. There's also big donors. And so it's not an equal playing field. And so if you think there's an advantage at the early round, there actually may not be in some cases. And also at different schools, they have different levels of advantage. So there's actually some really, public available data for some of this, not for the amount of detail of, athletes or really knowing the inside of each school. But I would recommend, even in just thinking about overall, you can look, and some of the Ivy League schools do not publish, but you can actually see Brown here. This is just the beginning of it. So this is from, last year's class. So the ED acceptance rate last year at Brown was 16%. The RD acceptance rate was 4%. And they admit over 50% of the class in early decision. And so that is a 4-to-1 acceptance ratio from ED to RD. Much better. You have a 4 times better chance of getting in. So at Brown, yeah, it makes a big difference. It's still, of course, very, very difficult. And their acceptance rate has gone down again this year. But it's just to say, if you look at some other schools, you can look at this acceptance ratio as just kind of a benchmark. I find that to be helpful of how much of a difference does early decision make on the whole at these different schools. You'll also find that if you're familiar with, or your child might be interested in liberal arts colleges, like highly selective liberal arts colleges. I actually live about 10 minutes from Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine. Their difference in acceptance rate is even higher than Brown's, right? So it's 27% in ED and then only 6% in RD. So their acceptance rate is the same almost as Brown's in RD. And they also have a 4.1 acceptance ratio between ED and RD. So makes a massive difference at these highly selective liberal arts colleges on the whole. And same with Barnard. Can see, so Barnard is also a great institution for girls who kind of, it's like a backdoor into Columbia, I always say. And so great option, but also massive difference between the ED and the RD acceptance rate. So just being, realistic that some of them do also have, ED2, but if you are, gunning for Harvard, there's probably not really a big difference for most people, unless you're an athlete, of applying, restricted early action versus regular decision there. And you are sacrificing the opportunity to apply early decision where you really do have a difference in an acceptance ratio. So that's just, an important thing to keep in mind. And then, just to look at, kind of just what I was saying before about it's, and I won't be able to do this here for every school, just off the top of my head of, unpacking each of these numbers. But this is the overall acceptance rate. And so of course you can see the trajectory, going down, it was, over the past 6 years. And so this is the class of 2027 that just came out. So these are, just historically the lowest acceptance rates ever. And so it's really important, to make sure that you are looking well beyond just, the Ivy League it's an athletic league. And so similar to what I was saying about researching schools, it is not wise to just apply to all 8 schools. They're very, very different. And so doing that research to understand where am I going to fit? Because I'm also going to be increasing my odds of acceptance if I'm applying to schools that are a good fit for me. Okay, and then we'll just take a look at the implicit strategies that I like to call are simple but not easy. So as I said, like there's really no silver bullet to getting into an Ivy League school or a highly selective school. There are certain strategies that they may sound simple, but honestly, so much is in the execution. And so I think that is where advisors and having guidance can really, really be helpful, because you may think that certain things are possible, or a certain plan may be feasible for your student, but it's really important to have insight from people who have seen many students go through this multi-year process to arrive at their college application timing. So so these are kind of like the implicit pieces that I think from the other side of the desk of the admissions officers is what you want to be thinking about. So ultimately, it is very, very important that your child's so what is very obvious. So what does that mean? Basically, admissions officers read thousands of applications. One of the biggest problems right now is actually because there are so many more applications going to these schools. They are spending less and less time reading students' applications. They cannot hire enough people to be reading applications. There are posts every fall that go out into my professional network from highly selective schools seeking part-time admissions readers. So, people like me, people like just high school counselors are getting paid to probably read your students' applications who are not full-time admissions officers, because they're just getting so overwhelmed. So what does this mean for your student's application? Is that it has to be very easy for somebody to understand who your child is, and why should they care about what they have done and who they are. It needs to be really clear what the purpose or the motivation is behind somebody's actions. So what I mean by that is sometimes I talk to students who tell me they want to go study medicine and they want to be a doctor. I say, why? I say, I think I'm good at science and I like helping people. Okay, why? I mean, I like labs, I like hands-on work. Okay, why? And so if you ask somebody why, 5 or 6 times and it doesn't really go anywhere, or they don't really have too much to say, that's kind of a problem. And so there needs to be alignment with what your students are studying, what they're doing, and what they want their future to be, with some very deep sense of an intrinsic motivation, of some deeper purpose. Sometimes I find, I had a student who got into Duke, who he was really interested in studying medicine. Now he's studying more like public health. But he talked in his personal statement about how he had his grandfather, who he came home and took care of when he was ill, and learned all about his illness. I also have another student who I'm just thinking about doctors right now, I guess, of another student who also wanted to study medicine. She applied to multiple countries. She's actually studying medicine now at University of Hong Kong. And she was very also had a illness in her family and was an athlete herself. And so she cared a lot about nutrition. And so it was a very clear personal link. And so in the best case scenario, there is something beyond just an intellectual head connection to your academic pursuits. There is something very personal to it, whether that's yourself, your upbringing, your family, your background. It doesn't have to exist, and it doesn't have to be forced by any means, but I do find that the applications that are more compelling and have more success at highly selective schools tend to have some sort of personal motivation behind it. And so what happens with this is there's this personal motivation, intrinsic purpose. You do something related to it. You take an online course, you enter a competition, you start a nonprofit, and you have some sort of result. And then you just do it again. And then from that, you build on this. You learn, I took a Harvard X, series on neuroscience. Now I'm going to go apply for, a U Chicago summer program. I took, so all of these activities continue to build on each other. And then there's a nice sequence of kind of cause and effect. And so that can come together as more of a coherent story and a narrative within a student's application profile. Another thing I want to mention is about substance in an application. I think that sometimes people can get very obsessed with what something should look like, rather than just making sure that there's like depth and substance to something. And so what I mean by that is, sometimes parents will say to me, well, I think like they just need to, they don't have any leadership. They should start a club at their school. Is it okay? Like that's a good idea. And definitely I encourage students to start clubs when it makes sense. If one doesn't exist, if that's a good avenue for them to, bring their interest into their school community. But sometimes those types of things, like, they're not really actually going to do anything. Sometimes the school is like very, the teachers aren't supportive of students doing clubs, or there's already one that exists, or whatever else. And then there's nothing really that happens. And that type of activity like is kind of hollow. And that's going to be pretty evident in an application. So, for your average college application, that's great. If we're talking about like an Ivy League application, like you're going to need to do a lot more than just start a club. Like starting a club is the start of something, right? And then what happens? So it's the impact, it's the escalation of something that really needs to be very impressive. So I'm including this student here, Mariella. Mariella is actually on a gap year right now. She graduated from high school last year and she's starting at Stanford in the fall. And Mariella, in her junior and senior year, she started a company herself called Sign Up. During the pandemic, she decided to teach herself and like learn sign language because she had a friend who I think was deaf. And then she realized that in learning sign language, she thought it would be really helpful if people who were deaf could watch sign language like kids on, like Disney movies with sign language. She realized this didn't exist. And so she started creating it herself. And now she has this company with like Sign Up has a partnership with Disney Plus, she's starting a partnership with Hulu. She's starting a partnership with Netflix. She has like a team. She's raised over $1 million in fundraising, and she's 18. This girl she goes after it, and you can tell that this has a lot of substance. It didn't matter exactly this was all just done out of her house while she was in lockdown. It wasn't like, anything. She had a mentor, she had advice, and she was kind of consistently working on building a business plan. But it wasn't with this idea in mind of like, I'm just going to go and do this competition or something. It was like, I want to do this. I want to create this, and I'm going to just build this. And so like this next week, she's presenting at the largest ed tech conference, like that, like Bill Gates is going to, and all like very famous people. And this 18-year-old girl is going to be there. And I just ran an event with her a couple weeks ago. And so just to say that, that this type of a student is, you can't really fake that in the application. It's going to be very obvious when an activity is kind of just started, but then nothing happened. And so that's why it's really important to focus on depth and having very concrete progress, rather than just doing a lot of things, but not having them really materialize into anything. And then something else too, just to say, there's, I think with highly selective admissions officers reading applications right now, they're also very aware of first privilege and how much privilege can buy in terms of resources targeted to college admissions. And so what I mean by that is there's a lot of students who do research with professors, a lot of students who try to publish papers, and it's going to be like, and so these can be great opportunities especially if students can get, if you're a STEM student, to be able to get into, your statewide science fair competition, if you can make it to ISIF or Regeneron, or, very, very impressive. But there's also really something to be said about being resourceful and trying to use local resources, whether that means, I sometimes work with my students to look at the universities around them, if they live near any, and contact professors in the departments that they're interested in. And so I think it's a great exercise for high school students anyway, to learn how to reach out and communicate with adults. Very important skill. And also they'll need to do that with admissions officers too, and potentially alumni for interviews during the admissions process, but also in developing their own profile. And if they, want to reach out, this is going to also reflect better in their application sometimes than, kind of like a what we call pay to play type of program. So that it can be great if the result is really positive. But I also would say, don't hesitate just because you think it's not necessarily as prestigious of a university. That doesn't matter. Again, it's much more about the substance than the form. So if your student finds a professor who has a really good alignment with their interests, and that professor also might have more time to dedicate to them, or, rather than just a lowly graduate student or something, they could have a great experience with that, rather than just finding, the name of a professor at Stanford who actually is not going to do anything with the student at all, because that will also be rather obvious to an admissions office when they're reading the application. And then I just wanted to mention as well, just with the application writing itself, especially with the personal statement, it can be the first thought that you should try to impress people. And so sometimes I do see that with, especially sometimes with very well-intentioned parents who have been involved in the personal statement writing process. But really the personal statement is there to show another side of a student that hasn't come through in other parts of the application. And just remember that the admissions officers, they tend to be young people who do not have a particular alignment with the academic area of interest of your student. And they're more just reading to, again, see, do they have intellectual curiosity? Have they been involved and demonstrated, contributions to their community? Are they interesting, good people? And are they relatable? So it should really just tell a good story and show who you are. So I just wanted to show the opening hook of the personal statement. And this is the same student of mine who got into Wharton. So this opening hook is what I call the opening opening paragraph of a personal statement. So Bon Jovi blasted through my earbuds. It's now or never. I ain't gonna live forever. I had just set a new personal deadlift best, right? So he's actually in the gym lifting weights. And then the rest of this essay, he actually relates it to his intellectual interest in economics, surprisingly. Just to show, I really like to work and figure out unexpected connections that exist between students' different interests, and to show how is there a common thread, and what is it about the student, what are their values and their interests that bring these different interests in to manifest in their life, that they can be so good at, or how do these two experiences kind of in parallel show the progress of the student's own development. So I actually never have students start with the Common App topics. So that's just a little side strategy. I think the 7 prompts from the Common App can really make students actually feel very stuck, that they have to fill in one of these things. I actually think that the most important thing that you can do in your Common App personal statement is to tell your most important story. And another thing I have students do at some point after we've drafted the first draft, I ask my student, what do you want somebody to know about you from reading this essay? And sometimes it's very clear to them, and sometimes they're not exactly sure. But again, just going back to the point of an admissions officer has a very short period of time to read your application, and they should be able to know exactly who you are and what is it that you want them to know from reading this part. What do you want them to know about hearing your voice, your one chance to have your voice? And so this is what he wrote is, I love to dive deep into my passions and progress quickly, but that caused significant setbacks, which impelled me to reconsider my approach. And now I prefer slow progress on my quest to achieve mastery, as going too fast carries the risk of crashing and exploding. So that's essentially what this is kind of the telling of what he does through showing. And so then when we went through and work on his personal statement again and again, we keep coming back to this takeaway. Is every paragraph, is everything you're doing in this essay bringing the reader closer to understanding and actually having this takeaway? So that really helps us stay focused and stay coherent on message. Okay. And then finally, just to wrap up, I think the final really important strategy is just alignment. And this kind of circles back, is that everything adds up, and ultimately it adds up to being yourself, right? Everyone else is already taken, as Oscar Wilde has said. And so, don't feel that your child has to fabricate some other, beyond themselves being. And I think as parents, it's also really important to also validate, that, because I think kids can feel very, very stressed out that they're not enough in this process. And honestly, the worst outcome for a high school senior is to feel that the college didn't reject them because there's not enough places, but they rejected them because they're personally not enough. And that's just not the case, really. I've heard from multiple admissions officers in highly selective schools that they could admit, if they had the space, 60% of the students who apply are academically admissible to their school, but they can only admit, 5%. And so there's a 55% of students who qualify, but they just, for a variety of these reasons, they don't make the cut. So I think as parents, together you can, with your kids, shoot for those schools, but just know that there's so much that's out of your control and out of your child's control too. And so, you can do everything you can to make sure it all adds up and there's alignment. But there's also a lot of other pieces that are just part of good luck these days too. But just with alignment, I think you want to make sure that there's consistency between the application pieces. That's really also what admissions officers are looking for, because there is this 60% who are admissible. They're not looking for reasons actually to not admit students. They're looking for reasons to admit you. So you need to give them more reasons to say yes to you, so that they can bring a student to the committee and say, this is why, we should admit this student. So I think with that, I will stop here. And yeah, I can stop sharing. So Bella, would you like to facilitate question answer. I see that there was actually a question that just came in.
OK，大家有问题可以问问题，我可以先把麦打开。这里有一个问题，我的 doctor 在10年级。Here have some questions. Can you see that? My doctor is in the 10th grade. And he's been going competition in the past year.
Yeah, so June, thank you for your question. So if she wants to, so you have a couple of questions. I'm not totally sure if she has already completed a math competition. And I would say you don't have to, give up if she's already invested in and or if she's already done a math competition. I would say certainly academic excellence in STEM areas or just across the board will be helpful. So even if you want to study biology, and remember that for most majors, for these selective colleges, it's an intended major. A lot of students will change their major. And so what you are applying as is saying, I intend to study medicine. Also, a lot of students will say they're pre-med and then change their mind later. They're 17, 18 years old when they make this decision. So in the US, because there is a lot of flexibility, they might change. So I would say, I get a lot of questions about math competitions. Math competitions are great. I would just say that, like AMC is the most popular, but because it's the most popular, it's also the most competitive. And if everything is about your time investment and how much, sacrifice you're making. And when you're doing that, you're not doing something else. So I would say if, she really wants to turn toward biology and medicine, she should only do the math competition if it's not going to sacrifice the time that she can spend on investing in the biology pieces. But if she is into both, I would say, again, it depends on which programs specifically, because I don't, it would really depend on which programs and some other details that I don't have right now.
Yeah, thank you. 还有任何人有问题吗？都可以在这里提问，或者打开你的麦提问也可以。我把麦已经打开了。
Okay, yeah, and I got one question. So they asked me which high school did I go to. I can answer that. So I went to a boarding school. I went to St. George's School in Newport, Rhode Island. What college I went to. So it's funny. So my undergraduate, I went to Colgate University in upstate New York. I almost transferred. I didn't like upstate New York once I got there. And I only transferred, I applied and I was accepted to Brown University. But then I decided to stay at Colgate. And then I went to Harvard Graduate School of Education for my master's. Abigail, suggestion on a 9th grader who's not sure about academic interests. Yeah, that's a great question. I would say getting exposed to some different possibilities. There's also, there's some assessments you can take, career assessments and exploration. There's some like U-Science or Strengths Finder that can help students just start to get a sense of, what's out there. I think some summer programs are a great way to also get exposure, like, either there's boarding schools or day schools or also college campuses that have different general programs. So it doesn't matter that you figure out definitively what you will study, but just to explore and to try and to say, yes, I like this. I don't really like this. What did I like or not like about this? And then you can adjust. How many colleges can you apply to? So the maximum Technically, you can apply to a lot, but it depends on how many supplemental essays you'll be writing. So the most selective colleges and universities in the US tend to have a lot of supplemental essays, which means that it's very hard to do a very good job applying to a lot of schools. So generally, students will apply to, I would say, it used to be like 9 to 12, maybe, or like 8 to 10, but now it's more like 10 to 15. The University of California system, you can apply to all of the campuses with one application, which has 4 essays. There's some other schools, that don't have supplemental essays, and they're easier to apply to for that reason. My child opened 2 online stores, first one with no sales, second one with only $800 profit. Is it worth mentioning? Yeah. So I would say, it depends on what you mean. And I'm guessing, so you're saying that the success is measured by the profits, which I certainly understand. And I think I would be curious about if you're selling, 2 items for $400, or if he sold X number of items, at $5 each, then that's a lot of items to sell. And I'm sure he has a lot of stories about what that process was like and what he learned. So sometimes you can learn the most from failing. And obviously he learned enough to make money the second time. So that's a good sign. I would definitely say anything, even if it's minor, is worth mentioning. It just depends on what else he has to talk about, of course, if that's something that plays a big or a small role in his essays. What's your suggestion of choosing a high school, such as a private boarding, private day, or public high school, in order to maximize the chance of getting into a top college? Yeah, I get this question a lot, and it really depends on your student, what kind of a learner they are, because a big public high school, you need to be very self-directed, right? Like there's not a lot of individual support necessarily, but there's probably a lot of courses, a lot of opportunities. So if they are somebody who's a strong self-advocate and can go to teachers and try to make relationships with them and knows what they want, then that can be great. For private day school or private boarding school, again, day school, it depends on what's in your area. If you like them, private boarding schools, same, they can be also fantastic. I went to a boarding school. I work with students in all 3 different types of environments, and I wouldn't say that one is better than the other. Boarding schools are very kind of enclosed environments, and so I think that in general, they provide a really strong education. Sometimes there are restrictions on what students can do to participate in activities beyond school. So for example, I'm working with a student right now who goes to a day and boarding school. She happens to be a day student there. But we sometimes joke because she had applied to go to a boarding school, a really selective one, and didn't get in initially. And so she was kind of disappointed, but now she's in 11th grade and she's a top ballerina in the US and worldwide. And her school has been allowing her to attend competitions all over the US. And so she's in the top 10 ranked ballerina, which will have a great impact on her college application. But she couldn't have done that. She couldn't have missed so much school if she had been at a very selective top boarding school. So it depends. If a student has many activities, how should he approach the activity list of Common Application? Yeah, so the Common Application has 10 open spaces for your activities. Traditionally, you should organize them based on which ones are most recent and which ones are the most, where you have the most involvement and the biggest impact. sometimes if a student has multiple similar ones, we group them together. For example, a student last year who was involved in like 3 different advocacy roundtable clubs at their school and had so many different activities and also theater performances. And so we grouped all of the plays and the theatrical performances together, and then all of the advocacy leadership clubs together. And so that worked. And then also if a student has that type of a situation, usually I recommend also making a resume, just usually a 1-page resume. That a lot of colleges will also allow students to upload a resume in addition to the Common App activity section. So that's it, but it takes definitely more time should be spent on the activities list than some people usually do. Okay. Oh, June. Okay, you're prom. Yeah, promise and hop. Okay, which one will help more? And 3 times Amy. Okay, great. Well, that's great for her. That's wonderful. Yeah, and so I mean, both of them are exceptional programs, and so it really depends. And so what I would say is, where would she like to spend her summer? And what other biology related work has she done? And again, because she's applying as a potential major, I wouldn't worry so much about that narrative necessarily. But again, like if I think you said she was going into 10th grade or is in 10th grade, so she still does have time. But then I would really want to see her double down on her biology, like research and other things in addition to math. Okay, a question about, oh yeah, this is a good question. Is it okay to talk about mental health history, grades temporarily sunk and bounced back after being treated? Yeah, and this is a really big and a very common concern and issue right now, especially during the pandemic. This is, it's been a very tough time for, I'm sure for you all and for your families and for your children to go through the pandemic, a lot of it, in middle school and high school. And that is, so I would use the additional information section in the Common App. Again, you want to make sure you work on the wording. But if you're using it to explain a dip in grades, that's extremely understandable. And yeah, I think just to talk about it in a very direct way. And I would say it's usually mostly acceptable to talk about it when it is behind you. Mental health history can be more difficult to talk about when you are kind of like living in it right now. It's still something I've worked with students through. I had a student this year who basically had a mental breakdown in September of her senior year. But we were able to work through things, and it was a miracle. But yeah, she's going to Wesleyan, which is a great liberal arts college this fall. And Wesleyan was even able to delay her early decision application. They allowed her to submit it like November 20th instead of November 15th or something. So my kid wants to be a lawyer. Her dream is Harvard. The tuition is very high. Is it important to be in Harvard when she is a freshman, or let her go to a cheaper college and let her take the law school entrance exam to Harvard? Okay, so it sounds like the question is to get into Harvard Law. And there's definitely no relationship between needing to go to Harvard as an undergrad and Harvard Law School. So I know a bunch of people who went to Harvard Law, and I think only one of them went to Harvard as an undergrad. So I would say the LSAT is what's really critical for Harvard Law, and also your GPA. And sometimes your GPA can be much higher in other schools than Harvard. So I worked with somebody for a bit who she had gone to Shanghai American School, and then she went to Princeton, and she studied Spanish and English literature at Princeton. And then she yeah, she just graduated from Harvard Law. I think she's graduating from Harvard Law School this year. So you do not need to go to Harvard to go to Harvard Law, but it's also very difficult to get into. It's another question. If a kid spent majority of time in ballet, but she would like to do engineering, how to balance between ballet and academic work since she won't have time to do extracurriculars. Yeah, so I would say for engineering, certainly a very strong academic foundation in math and physics. And so maximizing the academic options at the school that your child attends. So, you know, going through, if you're in, I don't know if you're in an AP curriculum, most likely if you're in the US, you know, going through BC calculus. Some of my students do that by 10th grade or 11th grade if they're really strong in engineering. And then they take, you know, advanced college level math in 11th and 12th grade. Or yeah, I mean, they go on and do much higher level math faster. And same with physics, to take physics AP sequence earlier. And then in terms of, you know, other engineering opportunities, I would say trying to fit it in when you can. I know that it's a balance. And so that it's hard. There's only so many hours in the day. As I was just talking about my student who does ballet too, I understand it's a lot. But you know, she is still able to manage it. And that's really just what you have to do, is try to achieve as much balance as possible. If you ultimately don't want your child to, you know, become a professional ballerina or study ballet in college, at some point you have to just give it up a little bit so there's more space for the academics. Child's GPA at school is around 100. She also participates in many sports and activities. Her sports varsity, new immigrant family, got a 780 in English or 780 in math, but could not reach 650 in English. Is there still a chance to apply to an Ivy League school? Yeah, this is also definitely a common situation that, you know, if you recently arrived to the US and your child has only been in the US for a couple of years, that like English SAT is tough. I would say, yeah, I mean, for an Ivy League school, a 650 English is not going to be enough right now, because the SAT is optional. The average SAT scores at any school with an acceptance rate below 20% is, you know, they're pretty much all above 1500. So I would say you can only apply to the test optional schools. The challenge though is if you are, especially for STEM students, if you don't have an SAT, it can really be a challenge. So I would say try to make sure that you're balancing that out with some AP testing, if you're not going to submit an SAT score, because they do want to see some standardized testing somewhere. Also, just to say, because you're mentioning the GPA, GPA can be a little bit of a difficult thing because a lot of high schools are giving very high grades these days. So you should also try to see, you know, if my child's GPA is 100, what does that mean? You know, if you can talk to the school counselor or an advisor, if there's anybody who has a sense of like, does that mean that my kid is in the top 10% of their class, their top 20% of the class? Because that's also the information that a lot of the school counselors will give to colleges. And that's what colleges care about. They're comparing your child academically to their peers in their school for their GPA. So 100 may mean, you know, nobody else has 100 and the next person has a 95, and that's crazy. Then they're the valedictorian. Or does that mean that, you know, 15% of the class has a 100 because there's grade inflation and it's, you know, with the number of APs you take, like that's just how it is. So it's a very different story. And then the question, yeah, apply math major and study biology afterward. I mean, or you can apply as like a math and biology double major. You know, again, these are intended majors. I think I would just say, you know, for her own sake too, if she really thinks that she wants to be a doctor and study medicine, go have an experience related to that, or, you know, do some sort of lab, you know, biology, if you can do some other sort of advanced course, or again, related more directly to medicine. I know Promis is like the entire summer, so it might be difficult, but if there's any other time to do that, she still has time. And so I think with that level of academic excellence, you know, there's still a story, a narrative that can be told. She has enough time to weave that together.
Okay, another questions? OK， 如果各位家长，如果你想要约一下 Julia 的免费的这个 interview 的话，对你的学生，对你的孩子，你可以扫这个码，你加我，或者是都可以，或者电话、email 都可以。你可以扫这2个码进群预约 Julia 的一个免费的那个 free interview 30分钟的。如果是你想联系我，跟他做一个免费的 interview， 也可以扫这个微信码。OK。
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful presentation today.
Yeah,
Share your experience.
happy to. Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you all
yeah.
for joining. Okay. All
So-
right. Thank you, Bella.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Julia. Good night. Good night. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye. OK， 家长如果还有其他的关于问题，也可以问我。如果是不想走的话，你可以在这里问我。现在申请大学越来越卷了啊，好像是。但是呢，为什么会那么卷呢？是因为其实是COVID-19 之后呢，很多学校放开了这个 SAT 的这个，你可以选择提交 SAT， 你也可以选择不提交。那么，还有就是那个个人文书也是放开了，所以呢，很多学生可能之前对于常青藤的学校，他不敢去申请。我不想这个去尝试这个常青藤的申请，或者是前30的学校。那么自从他放开了这个 SAT， 放开了这个很多的限制之后，很多人都去申请，那很多学校的这个申请率就加大了。那么比如说我举个例子，很多家长都过来问，为什么现在会越来越难？为什么会？其实它的难度是一直都没有降低，只不过申请的人增多了，他想看到你的这个所有的 college application 这个亮点的时候，他感觉到你是他正在寻找的人的时候，就难度就加大了。比如说过去的一个公主选驸马，如果底下来了5个人 ，OK， 5个人的话，那肯定是一眼望过去就一目了然嘛，对吧？高矮胖瘦歪瓜裂枣，一眼就看清楚了。但是当来150个人的时候，那公主就看不清楚了，就非常的就是眼花缭乱。那这个时候怎么办？她只能提高所有的这个线，比如说我进入文试、笔试，或者是说武试，那么就是提高所有的线。比如说NYU 这个我儿子的学校 NYU， 它对于华裔的这个 SAT 的要求就1550 SAT 1550，如果你没有在这个线之下，它可能会有一点点就是限制，对吧？所以就说另外一个呢，我们华人的孩子更多的是在成绩上非常追求成绩，家长非常追求成绩我的成绩一定要好，我要前10前 top 1 top 10，但是你忽略了在高中阶段忽略了你所有的这个社会活动。实际上你到底应该怎么建立你的社会活动？很多家长都过来问怎么建立你的社会活动。实际上你要很早的时候要启发你的小朋友，并不是说在高中阶段我们跟顾问一起来设定或者 build up 你的社会活动。当然了，这是可以的，没有问题，但是更多的时候发自你自身的一个 drive， 就是我要自己有motivation， 我自己想要去做什么。就包括刚才 Julia 举的这个例子，有一个女孩 他在15岁的时候就已经成立自己的公司，然后跟这个迪士尼公司有一些合作。那他为什么会想到这些？就是因为完全不一定是顾问的作用，也不一定是家长的作用，完全是他自己的一个想法。就是说，在家里的时候，家长不要限制小朋友的思维，你要让他充分的从小的时候就有自己的想法，做自己的 leader， 做很多人的 leader， 让他去，就是说天马行空，什么都可以做。当然，你要告诉他底线，比如说杀人放火，这个法律触犯法律的底线，对吧？就是其他的那些什么，都不能做啊，吸毒，对吧？这些都不能做，其他都可以去做。尤其是我们就是像我们经常家长会在高中阶段就会过来很多问题，就说啊，他要谈恋爱了，他要去参加 party， 这些都不行。如果你都限制他去参加 party， 你自己家里也不举办 party， 他怎么去知道社交的技巧呢？他怎么知道去跟别人相处的方式跟方法呢？比如说看到了很多的这种 party， 在很多学生在 party 上怎么相处，怎么打招呼，怎么 talk， 这个他都不知道。那么你等了他到了大学之后，你再着急，哦，他没有朋友，他没有女朋友，他没有男朋友，他一直都宅在家里。可是你在他最想要去训练的那个年纪，并没有机会让他去训练这个技巧，社交的技巧，他怎么可能会有一个突飞猛进的，到了大学的就全然就会了呢？这个就是一个非常矛盾的问题。所以家长在培养孩子的时候，一定要不要限制他，除了告诉底线不能碰，其他都可以去做，就是天马行空的。所以你为什么刚才他举的那个例子，有个女孩，哎，非常的那个跟迪士尼有合作，那他的父母又不可能说去帮他建立迪士尼的这种就是关系，对吧？肯定是他自己想要做，那么他自己去发展，一定是要鼓励你的孩子，你什么都可以去做，这是最重要的。其实顾问呢，只是说顾问是什么？顾问是资源，顾问是一种资源，顾问是告诉你什么样的路是最捷径的，你不让你走弯路，但顾问呢会告诉你方法。那么最重要的还是孩子自身本身的 drive，我想要什么？我想要一个自己的这样的东西，其实这是他成功的 successful 的一个很重要的一个关键。如果大家对我们的顾问非常的感兴趣，可以扫这个码预约茱莉亚的一个免费的一个就 interview。对你的孩子，我觉得这个茱莉亚也是非常非常 professional 的。希望我们更多的讲座呢，都会去启发我们的家长，带领我们的家长，就是更好的去培养我们的华人的孩子。其实我觉得我们华人的孩子，ABC 也好呀，或者在中国的也好，都非常的棒。我们非常的勤劳，非常的勇敢，非常的聪明，对吧？我们华人非常的聪明，做出的东西非常的棒。但是呢，就是说，你如果想去好大学，其实进入好大学是什么？就是进入到一个 level。我记得2018年的时候，有一个是 Harvard 还是记不清楚了，是 Harvard 还是 Stanford 的一个教授曾经说过，说西方的阶层分两个阶层，西方世界不是东方世界，是西方世界分两个阶层，这个阶层就是精英阶层和非精英阶层。那么当时听到这个话的时候，我觉得我不是特别懂，也不是特别认可。我觉得人是可以通过自己的努力实现一个阶级跃升的。但是呢，前几年我又看到了一个英国的一个纪录片，它是用20年的时间来 follow 了8个家庭，这8个家庭其中包括第一个是一个贵族，然后还有教授的孩子，然后还有 farmer 的孩子。还有就是普通工人的孩子，就有8个家庭跟踪这些小孩20年，20年还25年，就从他8、9岁的时候开始，还是10来岁的时候就 follow。那么20年过去了之后，有什么变化呢？ 贵族还是贵族，贵族有很多 old money，贵族他用 old money 投资了很多地方，但也有失败，但是他还是贵族，他的那个就是资产资金都没有太多的一个转变，但是他不是那么之前的就是几百年前或者是特别那个荣耀的那么，但是他还是一个 old money 的贵族，贵族还是贵族。那么 farmer 的儿子呢，他实现了他做什么？他还是做比如说非常普通的，哎这种。比如说就是一个什么什么公司的一个 manager 啊，或者还是去做 farmer 啊。唯一一个实现阶级跃升的是 professor 的一个儿子，他去考到了常青藤，然后他进入了一个大的公司去做一个非常顶级的一个工作。那么他实现了一个阶级跃升。那从这个现象来看，可能真的是。实现阶级跃升唯一的通道就是你要进入一个很好的学校，常青藤，或者是说当然这并不是一个唯一的一个，目前状况下不是一个唯一的一个观念，但是可能就只是一个说法而已。我也并不是完全赞同，但是它有一定的道理存在。所以当然了，培养孩子最重要的一点还是靠他自我的内驱力，而不仅仅是家长去 push 他。或者是说你请多贵的这个顾问，当然请顾问也是很重要的，因为顾问会给你指引方向，顾问会告诉你什么是最正确的路，顾问会告诉你你不要走弯路，根据你的特点，根据你的潜质来挖掘你。当然，更重要的还是孩子自身本身。那么我们这么多年做教育，从2014年在美国成立公司，接触过无数非常非常多的孩子。之前我们那个也办过很多国际学校的夏令营冬令营，每年都来100-200个孩子。那么我们感触最深的，真是我们是见孩无数，就是每一个孩子在我们面前扫过，基本上我们大概跟他说几句话，就知道他的这个大概的这个标准水平和未来的方向，大概其就是这些，我们都能知道。那么其实最重要的一点，我觉得什么样的孩子能够成功？其实我觉得就是这个家长什么都不懂，往往这个孩子容易成功，因为他什么都不懂，给了包括英语可能都不是特别懂，或者不太很流利的家长，往往他的孩子会比较成功。为什么？是因为父母管的很少，他不是说在生活饮食起居上不管，他是在他的学术上和 academic 上和他的社会活动上。他完全的放手让孩子去做，完全信任孩子，而且完全去支持孩子所有的做法，包括我自己的儿子也是。我也一开始在教育孩子的过程中，一开始进入美国，我们从他10岁的时候进入美国，其实很多美国东西我也是不懂的，但是我是在旁边跟着他学，而且呢，我是完全是让他做 leader 做 boss，就是让他掌控所有的一切，所以他现在才能有现在今天的这个成就。所以他进入了纽约大学进入了那个Stern， 然后进入了就有很多自己的想法，创建了club 在高中，然后又是中尼尔的学生会主席，然后又是辩论队，进入辩论队，然后再打比赛，后来就排到纽约州第30位然后又向白宫网站发起请愿，要求控枪。那么所有这些都是他自己的行为，父母没法管，也没法去不懂。所以我希望各位的家长就是你们要给你的孩子放手，这是第一位的放手。另外一个培养孩子到底是从什么时候开始？很多家长都问，我觉得不是从9年级开始，也不是从8年级开始，从更早开始，你要去培养他去看世界，因为看世界之后多阅读多看世界的格局就会不一样，格局就会很高远，格局就不一样。他看的东西越多，了解的资讯越多，他走出去，他跟人去 talk，people 去 talk， 然后去说话，然后他去看书，博览群书，那么可能比你在旁边唠叨要好很多很多。如果你有时间的话，你有经费的话，你可以跟他去全球旅游，多读书，博览群书，读那种就是大厚书，这种获奖的书，我觉得对孩子是比你在旁边唠叨是有效很多的。嗯。 没有什么问题吗？有什么问题咱们可以开麦聊。可以看看还有多少家长啊？今天没有问题，我们就还有这么多，没有问题，我们就今天就那什么，我可以把麦打开，你们如果有问题。